Okay, so in this presentation, I'll talk about authorized errors and how we can deal with them. And I'll start with a little bit of theory, not too much, but with theory that will be important to consider how we can deal with errors. There are some key terms. I don't want to go through them one by one because maybe you already know some of them. So type in the chat box which of the terms you'd like me to explain. And sort of first come, first served. We probably won't have time to go through all of them. Okay, intralingual, Natalia asks, intralingual is an error that happens sort of within the student's interlanguage. So it's caused by the student misapplying a rule or maybe not knowing a rule in the L2, whereas an interlingual, it's between languages, interlingual. So usually it's the negative transfer from student to L1. Perhaps another, okay, I'll explain that again. Interlingual is a transfer from students L1 that has a negative influence on students L2 and it's producing errors. Whereas intralingual is when the student misapplies a rule or maybe the student doesn't know the rule yet. And mistake is a slip. So when we're speaking our L1, we make mistakes sometimes as well. And an error is more serious, is probably the student misapplying the rule or not knowing the rule just yet. Pre-systematic is the student doesn't know the rule yet. Systematic is the student is kind of experimenting with the rule that they've just learned. And post-systematic is the student knows the rule, but nevertheless makes a mistake. Okay, perhaps that's enough with the theory. And so just read on the same page. I just wanted to show two exemplary fossils. On the left, we've got T-Rex. On the right, I think you know who that person is. But putting jokes aside, there are some practical considerations if we're talking about errors. So if we've got the two examples, she goes to school, or he's lived here since 2 years. Before you start correcting your students, I think you want to ask yourself a couple of questions. So for example, is this an error or a mistake? I.e., is this a slip, for example? Does the student know the rule, or maybe they're just practicing the rule at the moment? Is it a global error? So for example, does the error cause misunderstanding? Or maybe it's a local one, which doesn't really cause any misunderstanding. And I think the last question is perhaps the most important. Does the learner really want to be corrected? Because maybe the learner doesn't really care. Maybe they're going more for being communicative, and they don't really want to be 100% correct. So I think in this case, you wouldn't really correct them. And let's now look at some activities. The first bunch of activities are immediate correction activities, so sort of on the spot when the mistake happens. And the first ones that I chose are dictations. They don't necessarily have to be dictations in the traditional sense of the word when the student writes things down. They can be, but they also can be done orally, which is much quicker and involves the student, sort of thinking on the spot very quickly. I won't explain all of them because we don't have time for that. I'll explain maybe one of them, and that's transformation dictation. That's when you dictate a couple of sentences with the error. With a couple of sentences, like for example, I go to school, and they go to the cinema, and then the student has to transform it, for example, to the third person to practice the third person S. And again, this could be done orally. So you say, I go to school, and you pick one student, and you say, she, and the student has to say, she goes to school. Right? And the other examples of dictations, you can find them on my blog, and I'll give you the link at the end of this presentation. There are also, the next bunch of activities are drills, and they're kind of similar to dictations, but they involve a lot of repetition. And I think repetition is really the key here. If you want to deal with fossilized errors, you want to repeat the correct version over and over and over again to form new mental habits. And again, all these drills are explained on my blog, but maybe I'll go through one or two. Substitution drill is basically the same as the transformation dictation, and multiple one is that you substitute two items in the sentence, so not just she, but maybe, for example, the verb as well, to make it more difficult. And I really like number 3, open-ended drills, because they're a little bit more communicative, and the idea is that the student has to either finish a sentence or answer a question, practicing the target language, but so that the answer makes sense and it's logical. So, for example, if we're on the third person S, you can ask them questions like, what does Messi do? And then the student has to say, Messi plays football. And you go with students one by one, and the idea is that you do it really quickly. And the students have to be really quick on their feet if you're doing open-ended drills, because it's not only that they have to practice the target language and get rid of that fossilized error, but they also have to think about the answer and make the sentence logical. And I think number 4 is kind of nice as well for the shyer students, is that you model a language and they repeat it but quietly to themselves. And as a language learner, I do a lot of those myself. I just practice things in my mind, or I mumble them quietly when I'm commuting, or I don't know, I'm just at home and I kind of think about my errors and I sort of quietly model the correct language. So it's really good as well for out-of-class practice. Okay, there are also other immediate correction activities. You can do a funny face, can discover the wrong, the intonation, she go to school. You can have yellow or red cards if you're into football, or your students are. You can have a poster or a card with the mistake. So for the third person S, you could just draw a snake and take out the card or the poster whenever somebody makes a mistake. And instead of the dictations or drills, you could do mimes or drawings, where the student has to guess the sentence and practice the correct language. Okay, and there are also delayed correction activities, of course, that you can do with the students. Some of them are very obvious. You can, for example, photocopy a few pages from a grammar book and give it to them for homework. Perhaps not very imaginative, but again, with fossilized errors, you've got to just repeat things and repeat and repeat and repeat to form new habits. But I think perhaps more imaginative and less common. Number 4, for example, are error journals and logs. You can keep them as a teacher. Just write down what kind of typical mistakes your students are making. But you can also involve your students and get each student to keep a diary, a journal of what mistakes or what errors they're making. Right? And also number 8, Memrise, Quizlet. There are also other websites, online software that allows you to usually practice vocabulary, but you could practice grammar as well and just create a course with sentences with the common mistakes. And again, it involves a lot of repetition. Perhaps it's not very fun, but you repeat and repeat and repeat until you get it right. And I think the last thing I really want to emphasize is you really want to help your students get rid of those fossilized errors. You need to get them on board. Because if the student doesn't really care, then, well, there is no point in correcting them. And so I think the first thing they have to do, and that I do as a learner, if I want to get rid of some errors, is to monitor my own language, how I speak, and be sort of more aware of what's happening and why I'm making the mistake and when it happens. And also monitoring other students in the class. So if I'm in a language class, I'll kind of listen to what my friends are saying and either notice good, but also notice bad language mistakes. And this leads us to peer correction. So have, group activities when one person kind of monitors when other people are speaking and they have to spot mistakes. But it's got to be personalized, so you've got to tell that person who's monitoring that, look, you've got to focus on Andres' third person S and correct that. Okay? And there are also other ones like mutual dictation, so you can do dictation and drills. The students can do it instead of you doing it. So I know it was very quick and I couldn't show you all the activities, but as I said, you can find the drills and dictations on my blog, www.recollections.wordpress.com. I also co-record podcasts at theteflshow.com, and I also run TEFL Equity Advocates. So if you're interested in equal opportunities for native and non-native speakers, check out teflequityadvocates.com. And that's it. Thanks very much for coming, and thanks, Rob, for organizing it all and having me again.